The Glass Castle, pages 96 to 106. Dad also scavenged a couple of tables and chairs, and he built some makeshift closets, which were actually kind of nifty, by hanging lengths of pipe from the ceiling with wires. Mom and Dad took over the room with the stove, and it became a combined living room, master bedroom, art studio, and writer's study. We put the sofa bed there, though once we opened it, it never went back to being a sofa. Dad built shelves all along the upper walls to store Mom's art supplies. She set up her easel under the stovepipe right next to the back window because she said it got natural sunlight, which it did, relatively speaking. She put her typewriters under another window with shelves for her manuscripts and works in progress, and she immediately started thumbtacking index cards with story ideas to the walls. We kids all slept in the middle room. At first, we shared one big bed that had been left by the previous owner, but Dad decided we were getting a tad old for that. We were also too big to sleep in cardboard boxes, and there wasn't enough room on the floor for them anyway. So we helped Dad build 2 sets of bunk beds. We made the frames with 2x4s, then we drilled holes in the sides and threaded ropes through. For mattresses, we laid cardboard over the ropes. When we finished, our bunk beds looked sort of plain, so we spray painted the sides with ornate red and black curlicues. Dad came home with a discarded 4-drawer dresser, 1 drawer for each of us. He also built each of us a wooden box with sliding doors for personal stuff. We nailed them on the wall above our beds, and that's where I kept my geode. The third room at 93 Little Hobart Street, the kitchen, was in a category all its own. It had an electric stove, but the wiring was not exactly up to code, with faulty connectors, exposed lines, and buzzing switches. Helen Keller must have wired this damn house, Dad declared. He decided it was too convoluted to bother fixing. We called the kitchen the loose juice room because on the rare occasions that we had paid the electricity bill and had power, we'd get a wicked electric shock if we touched any damp or metallic surface in the room. The first time I got zapped, it knocked my breath out and left me twitching on the floor. We quickly learned that whenever we ventured into the kitchen, we needed to wrap our hands in the driest socks or rags we could find. If we got a shock, we'd announce it to everyone else, sort of like giving a weather report. "Big jolt from touching the stove today," we'd say. "Wear extra rags." One corner of the kitchen ceiling looked like a sieve. Every time it rained, the plasterboard ceiling would get all swollen and heavy, with water streaming directly from the center of the bulge. During one particularly fierce rainstorm that spring, the ceiling grew so fat it burst, and water and plasterboard came crashing down onto the floor. Dad never repaired it. We kids tried patching the roof on our own with tar paper, tinfoil, wood, and Elmer's glue, but no matter what we did, the water found its way through. Eventually, we gave up. So every time it rained outside, it rained in the kitchen, too. At first, Mom tried to make living at 93 Little Hobart Street seem like an adventure. The woman who'd lived there before us had left behind an old-fashioned sewing machine that she operated with a foot treadle. My mom said it would come in handy because we would make our own clothes, even when the electricity was turned off. She also claimed you didn't need patterns to sew. You could get creative and wing it. Shortly after we moved in, Mom Lori and I measured one another and tried to make our own dresses. It took forever, and they came out baggy and lopsided with sleeves that were different lengths and armholes in the middle of our backs. I couldn't get mine over my head until Mom snipped out a few stitches. "It's stunning," she said, but I told her I looked like I was wearing a big pillowcase with elephant trunks sticking out of the sides. Lori refused to wear hers outdoors or even indoors, and Mom had to agree that sewing wasn't the best use of our creative energy or our money. The cheapest cloth we could find cost 79 cents a yard, and you needed more than 2 yards for a dress. It made more sense to buy our thrift store clothes. And they had the armholes in the right places. Mom also tried to make the house cheerful. She decorated the living room walls with her oil paintings, and soon every square inch was covered, except for the space above her typewriter, reserved for index cards. We had vivid desert sunsets, stampeding horses, sleeping cats, snow-covered mountains, bowls of fruit, blooming flowers, and portraits of us kids. Since Mom had more paintings than we had wall space, Dad nailed long shelf brackets to the wall. And she hung one picture in front of another until they were 3 or 4 deep. Then she'd rotate the paintings. Just a little redecorating to perk the place up, she'd say. But I believe she thought of her paintings as children and wanted them to feel that they were all being treated equally. Mom also built rows of shelves in the windows and arranged brightly colored bottles to catch the light. Now it looks like we have stained glass, she announced. It did, sort of, but the house was still cold and dank. Every night for the first few weeks, lying on my cardboard mattress and listening to the sound of rainwater dripping in the kitchen, I dreamed of the desert and the sun and the big house in Phoenix with the palm tree in the front and the orange trees and oleanders out back. We had owned that house outright, still owned it, I kept thinking. It was ours, the one true home we'd ever had. Are we ever going home? I asked Dad one day. Home? Phoenix. This is home now. Seeing as how Welch was our new home, Brian and I figured we'd make the best of it. Dad had shown us the spot near the house where we were going to put the foundation and basement for the glass castle. He'd measured it off, marked it with stakes and string. Since Dad was hardly ever home, he was out making contacts and investigating the UMW, he told us, and never got around to breaking ground. Brian and I decided to help. We found a shovel and pickaxe at an abandoned farm and spent just about every free minute digging a hole. We knew we had to dig big and deep. No point in building a good house unless you put down the right foundation, Dad always said. It was hard work, but after a month we dug a hole deep enough for us to disappear in. Even though we hadn't squared the edges or smoothed the floor, we were still pretty darn proud of ourselves. Once Dad had poured the foundation, we could help him on the frame. But since we couldn't afford to pay the town's trash collection fee, our garbage was really piling up. One day, Dad told us to dump it in the hole. But that's for the glass castle, I said. Oh, it's a temporary measure, Dad told me. He explained that he was going to hire a truck to cart the garbage to the dump all at once. But he never got around to that either, and as Brian and I watched, the hole for the glass castle's foundation slowly filled with garbage. Around that time, probably because of all the garbage, a big, nasty-looking river rat took up residence at 93 Little Hobart Street. I first saw him in the sugar bowl. This rat was too big to fit in an ordinary sugar bowl, but since Mom had a powerful sweet tooth, putting at least 8 teaspoons in a cup of tea, we kept our sugar in a punch bowl on the kitchen table. This rat was not just eating the sugar. He was bathing in it, wallowing in it, positively luxuriating in it, his flickering tail hanging over the side of the bowl, flinging sugar across the table. When I saw him, I froze and backed out of the kitchen. I told Brian, and we opened the kitchen door cautiously. The rat had climbed out of the sugar bowl and leaped up onto the stove. We could see his teeth marks in the pile of potatoes, our dinner, on a plate on the stove. Brian threw the cast iron skillet at the rat. It hit him and clanged on the floor, but instead of fleeing, the rat hissed at us as if we were the intruders. We ran out of the kitchen, slammed the door, and stuffed rags in the gap beneath it. That night, Maureen, who's 5, was too terrified to sleep. She kept on saying that the rat was coming to get her. She could hear it creeping nearer and nearer. I told her to stop being such a wuss. I really do hear the rat, she said. I think it's close to me. I told her she was letting fear get the best of her. And since this is one of those times that we had electricity, I turned on the light to prove it. There, crouched on Maureen's lavender blanket, a few inches away from her face, was the rat. She screamed and pushed off her covers, and the rat jumped to the floor. I got a broom and tried to hit the rat with the handle, but it dodged me. Brian grabbed a baseball bat and we maneuvered it, hissing and snapping into a corner. Our dog Tinkle, the part Jack Russell Terrier who'd followed Brian home one day, caught the rat in his jaws and banged it on the floor until it was dead. When Mom ran into the room, Tinkle was strutting around all pumped up, like the proud beast slayer that he was. Mom said she felt a little sorry for the rat. Rats need to eat too, she pointed out. Even though it was dead, it deserved a name, she went on, so she christened it Rufus. Brian, who had read that primitive warriors placed the body parts of their victims on stakes to scare off their enemies, hung Rufus by the tail from a poplar tree in front of our house the next morning. That afternoon, we heard the sound of gunshots. Mr. Freeman, who lived next door, had seen the rat hanging upside down. Rufus was so big, Mr. Freeman thought he was a possum. Went and got his hunting rifle and blew him clean away. There was nothing left of Rufus but a mangled piece of tail. After the Rufus incident, I slept with a baseball bat in my bed. Brian slept with a machete in his. Maureen could barely sleep at all. She kept dreaming she was being eaten by rats, and she used every excuse she could to spend the night at friends' houses. Mom and Dad shrugged off the Rufus incident. They told us that we'd done battle with fiercer adversaries in the past, and we would again someday. What are we going to do about the garbage pit? I asked. It's almost filled up. Enlarge it, Mom said. We can't keep dumping garbage out there. I said, what are people going to think? Life's too short to worry about what other people think, Mom said, and anyway, they should accept us for who we are. I was convinced that people might be more accepting of us if we made an effort to improve the way 93 Little Hobart Street looked. There were plenty of things we could do, I felt, that would cost almost nothing. Some people around Welch cut tires into 2 semicircles, painted them white, and used them as edging for their gardens. Maybe we couldn't afford to build the glass castle quite yet, but certainly we could put painted tires around for our front yard to spruce it up. It would make us fit in a little bit. I pleaded with Mom. It sure would, Mom said. But when it came to Welch, she had no interest in fitting in. I'd rather have a yard filled with genuine garbage than with trashy lawn ornaments. I kept looking for other ways to make improvements. One day, Dad brought home a 5-gallon can of house paint left over from some job he'd worked on. The next morning, I pried the can open. It was nearly full of bright yellow paint. Dad had brought some paint brushes home, too. A layer of yellow paint, I realized, would completely transform our dingy gray house. It would look, at least from the outside, almost like the houses other people lived in. I was so excited by this prospect of living in a perky yellow home that I could barely sleep that night. I got up early the next day and tied my hair back, ready to begin the house painting. If we all work together, we can get it done in a day or two, I told everyone. But Dad said 93 Little Hobart Street was such a dump, we should not waste our time on, or energy on it, we'll be devoting to the glass castle. Mom said she thought our bright yellow houses were tacky. Brian and Lori said we didn't have the ladders and scaffolding we needed. Dad was making no visible progress on the glass castle, and I knew that the can of yellow paint would sit on the porch until I undertook the job myself. I'd borrow a ladder or make one, I decided. I was certain that once everyone saw the amazing transformation of the house begin, they'd all join in. Out on the porch, I opened the can and stirred the paint with a stick, blending in the oil that had risen to the surface until the paint, which was the color of buttercups, had turned creamy. I dipped in a fat brush and spread the paint along the old clapboard siding in long, smooth strokes. It went on bright and glossy. It looked better than I'd hoped. I started on the far side of the porch, around the door that went into the kitchen. In a few hours, I had covered everything that could be reached from the porch. Parts of the front were still unpainted, and so were the sides, but I'd used less than a quarter of the paint. If everyone else helped, we could paint all the areas I couldn't reach, and in no time we'd have a cheerful yellow house. But neither Mom, nor Dad, nor Brian, nor Lori, nor Maureen was impressed. So, part of the front of the house is yellow now, Lori said. That's really going to turn things around for us. I was going to have to finish the job myself. I tried to make a ladder from bits of scrap wood, but it kept collapsing whenever I put my weight on it. I was still trying to build a sturdy ladder when, during a cold snap a few days later, a can of my paint froze solid. When it got warm enough for the paint to thaw, I opened the can. During the freeze, the chemicals had separated, and the once smooth liquid was as lumpy and runny as curdled milk. I stirred it as hard as I could, and I kept stirring it, even after I knew the paint was ruined, because I also knew that we'd never get more, and instead of a freshly painted yellow house or even a dingy gray one, we now had a weird-looking half-finished patch job, one that announced to the world that the people inside the house wanted to fix it up, but lacked the gumption to get the work done. Little Hobart Street led into one of those hollows so deep and narrow that people joked you had to pipe in the sunlight. The neighborhood did have a lot of kids. Maureen had real friends for the first time, and we all tended to hang out at the National Guard Armory at the foot of the hill. The boys played tackle football in the training field. Most of the girls my age spent their afternoons sitting on the brick wall surrounding the armory, combing their hair and touching up their lip gloss and pretending to get all indignant, but secretly loving it if a crew-cut reservist wolf whistled at them. One of the girls, Cindy Thompson, made it a special effort to befriend me, but it turned out that what she really wanted was to recruit me for the junior Ku Klux Klan. Neither putting on makeup nor wearing a sheet had much appeal for me, So I played football with the boys, who would waive their guys-only rule and let me join a team if they were short a player. The better-off folk of Welch had not exactly flocked to our part of town. A few miners lived along the street, but most of the grown-ups didn't work at all. Some of the moms had no husbands, and some of the dads had black lung. The rest were either too distracted by their troubles or just plain unmotivated, so pretty much everyone grudgingly accepted some form of public aid. Although we were the poorest family on Little Hobart Street, Mom and Dad never applied for welfare or food stamps, and they always refused charity. When teachers gave us bags of clothes from church drives, Mom made us take them back. "We can take care of our own," Mom and Dad liked to say. "We don't accept handouts from anyone." If things got tight, Mom kept reminding us that some of the other kids on Little Hobart Street had it tougher than we did. The 12 Grady kids had no dad. He either died in a mine cave-in or run off with a whore, depending on who you listened to. And their moms spent her days in bed suffering from migraines. As a result, the Grady boys ran completely wild. It was hard to tell them all apart because they all wore blue jeans and torn t-shirts and had their heads shaved bald to keep away lice. When the oldest boy found their dad's old pump-action shotgun under their mom's bed, he decided to get in some target practice on Brian and me, firing buckshot at us as we ran for our lives through the woods. And then there were the Halls. All 6 of the Hall children had been born mentally retarded, and although they were now middle-aged, they all still lived at home with their mom and dad. When I was friendly to the oldest, Kenny Hall, who was 42, he developed a powerful crush on me. The other kids in the neighborhood teased Kenny by telling him that if he gave them $1 stripped down to his skivvies and showed them his wanker, they'd arrange for me to go on a date with him. On a Saturday night, if he'd been set up like that, he'd come stand on the street in front of our house sobbing and hollering about me not keeping our date, and I'd have to go down and explain to him that the other kids had played a trick on him, and that although he didn't have many admirable qualities, I had a policy against dating older men. The family who had it the toughest on Little Hobart Street, I would have to say, was the Pastors. The mother, Jenny Sue Pastor, was the town whore. Jenny Sue Pastor was 33 years old and had 8 daughters and 1 son. Their names all ended with Y. Her husband, Clarence Pastor, had black lung and sat on the front porch of their huge sagging house all day long, but he never smiled or waved at passerby. He just sat there like he was frozen. Everyone in town said he'd been impotent for years, and none of the Pastor kids was his. Jenny Sue Pastor pretty much kept to herself. At first, I wondered if she lay around in a lacy negligee all day, smoking cigarettes and waiting for gentlemen callers. Back in Battle Mountain, the women lounging on the front porch of the Green Lantern, I've long since figured out what they really did, wore white lipstick and black mascara and partially unbuttoned blouses that showed the tops of their brassieres. But Jenny Sue Pastor didn't look like a whore. She was a blousy woman with dyed yellow hair, and from time to time we saw her out in the front yard chopping wood or filling a scuttle from the coal pile. She usually wore the same kinds of aprons and canvas farm coats worn by the rest of the women on Little Hobart Street. She looked like any other mom. I also wondered how she did her whoring with all those kids to look after. One night I saw a car pull up in front of the Pastor house and blink its headlights twice. After a minute, Jenny Sue came running out the door and climbed in the front seat. Then the car drove off. Kathy was Jenny Sue Pastor's oldest daughter. The other kids treated her like a total pariah, crowing that her mother was a whore and calling her lice girl. Truth was, she did have a pretty advanced case of head lice. She kept trying to befriend me. One afternoon on the way home from school, when I told her we'd lived for a while in California, she lit up. She said her mama had always wanted to go there. She asked if maybe I could come over to her place and tell her mama all about life in California. Of course I went. I'd never gotten inside the Green Lantern, but now I'd get an up-close look at a genuine prostitute. There are all kinds of things I wanted to know. Was whoring easy money? Was it ever any fun, or was it just gross? Did Kathy and her sisters and her father all know Jenny Sue Pastor was a whore? What did they think of it? I didn't plan on flat out asking these questions, but I did think that by getting inside the Pastor's house, meeting Jenny Sue, I'd come away with some idea of the answers. Clarence Pastor, sitting on the porch, ignored Kathy and me as we walked by. Inside, there were all these tiny rooms connected together like boxcars. Because of the way the house was settling on the eroding hillside, the floors and ceilings and windows tilted at different angles. There were no paintings on the walls, but the Pastors had taped up pictures of smartly dressed women from Sears Roebuck catalogs. Kathy's little sister scampered around noisily, half-dressed. None of them looked alike. One was redheaded, one a blonde, one had black hair, and they were all different shades of brown. Sweet Man, the youngest, crawled along the living floor living room floor, sucking on a fat dill pickle. Jenny Sue Pastor sat at the table in the kitchen. At her elbow was the carcass of a big, expensive roaster, the kind we could hardly ever afford. She had a tired, lined face, but her smile was cheerful and open. "Pleased to meet you," she said to me, wiping her hands on her shirt tail. "We ain't used to getting visitors." Jenny Sue offered us seats at the table. She had heavy breasts that swayed when she moved, and her blonde hair was dark at the roots. "Y'all help me with this bird, and I'll fix you a couple of Jenny Sue's special chicken rolls." She turned to me. "You know how to pick a chicken clean?" "I sure do," I said. I hadn't had anything to eat all day. "Well, show me then," Jenny Sue said. I went for a wing first, pulling apart the spindly double bones and getting all the meat trapped there. Then I set to work on the leg and thigh bones, snapping them at the joints and peeling off the tendons and digging out the marrow. Kathy and Jenny Sue were also working on the bird, but soon they stopped to watch me. From the tail, I pulled that nice piece of meat that everybody misses. I turned the carcass upside down and scraped off the jellied fat and meat flecks with my fingernails. I struck my arm elbow deep into the bird to excavate any meat clinging to the rib cage. "Girl," Jenny Sue said, "in all my days I've never seen no one pick a chicken clean like you." I held up the spear-shaped cartilage in the breastbone, which most people don't eat, and bit down with a satisfying crunch. Jenny Sue scraped the meat into a bowl, mixed it with mayonnaise and Cheez Whiz, then crushed a handful of potato chips and added them. She spread the mixture onto 2 slices of Wonder Bread and then rolled each slice into a cylinder and passed them to us. "Birds in a blanket," she said. "They tasted great." "Mama, Jeanette lived in California," Kathy said. "That's so?" Jenny Sue said. "Live in California and be a stewardess. That was my dream," she sighed. "Never got beyond Bluefield." I told her and Kathy about life in California. It quickly became clear they had no interest in desert mining towns, so I told them about San Francisco and then about Las Vegas, which wasn't exactly in California, but they didn't seem to care. I made the days we'd spent there seem like years, and the showgirls I'd seen from a distance seemed like close friends and neighbors. I described the glittering casinos and the glamorous high rollers, the palm trees and the swimming pools, the hotels with ice-cold air conditioning, and the restaurants where hostesses with long white gloves lit flaming desserts. "It don't get no better than that," Jenny Sue said. "No, ma'am, it sure does. It sure don't," I told her. Sweet Man came in crying, and Jenny Sue picked him up and let him suck some mayonnaise off her finger. "You did good on that bird," Jenny Sue told me. "You strike me as the kind of girl who's one day going to be eating roast chicken and those on-fire desserts just as much as you want." She winked. It was only on the way home that I realized I hadn't gotten any answers to my questions. When I was sitting there talking to Jenny Sue, I'd forgotten she was a whore. One thing about whoring, it put a chicken on the table. We fought a lot in Welch, not just to fend off our enemies, but to fit in. Maybe it was because there was so little to do in Welch. Maybe it was because life there was hard and it made people hard. Maybe it was because of all the bloody battles over unionizing the mines. Maybe it was because mining was dangerous and cramped and dirty work, and it put all the miners in bad moods, and they came home and took it out on their wives. Who took it out on their kids, took it out on other kids. Whatever the reason, it seemed that just about everyone in Welch, men, women, boys, and girls, liked to fight. There were street brawls, bar stabbings, parking lot beatings, wife slappings, and toddler wailings. Sometimes it was simply a matter of someone throwing a stray punch, and it would be all over before you knew it started. Other times it would be more like a 12-round prize fight with spectators cheering on the bloody, sweating opponents. Then there were the grudges and feuds that went on for years. A couple of brothers beating up some guy because back in the 50s his father had beaten up their father. A woman shooting her best friend for sleeping with her husband, and the best friend's brother then stabbing the husband. You'd walk down McDowell Street. Half the people you passed seemed to be nursing an injury sustained in local combat. There were shiners, split lips, swollen cheekbones, bruised arms, scraped knuckles, and bitten earlobes. We lived in some pretty scrappy places back in the desert, but Mom said Welch was the fightingest town she'd ever seen. Brian and Lori and Maureen and I got into more fights than most kids. Denisha Hewitt and her friends were only the first in a whole line of little gangs who did battle with one or more of us. Other kids wanted to fight us because we had red hair, because Dad was drunk, because we wore rags, didn't take as many baths as we should have, because we lived in a falling down house that was partly painted yellow and had a pit filled with garbage, because they'd go by our dark house at night and see that we couldn't even afford electricity. But we always fought back, usually as a team. Our most spectacular fight, our most audacious tactical victory, the Battle of Little Hobart Street, took place against Ernie Goad and his friends when I was 10 and Brian was 9. Ernie Goad was a pug-nosed, thick-necked kid who had little eyes set practically on the sides of his head like a whale. He acted as if it was his sworn mission to drive the Wallace family out of town. It started one day when I was playing with some other kids on the tank parked next to the armory. Ernie Goad appeared and began throwing rocks at me and yelling that the Walleses should all leave Welch because we were stinking it up so bad. I threw a couple rocks back and told him to leave me alone. "Make me," Ernie said. I don't make garbage," I shouted. "I burn it." This was usually a foolproof comeback, making up in scorn what it lacked in originality, but on this occasion it backfired. "Y'all Wallaces don't burn garbage," Ernie yelled back. "Y'all throw it in a hole next to your house. Y'all live in it." I tried to think of a comeback to his comeback, but my mind seized up because what Ernie had said was true. We did live in garbage. Ernie stuck his face in mine. "Garbage? You live in garbage because you are garbage." I shoved him good and hard, then turned to the other kids hoping for backup, but they were easing away and looking down as if they were ashamed to have been caught playing with a girl who had a garbage pit next to her house. That Saturday, Brian and I were reading on the sofa when one of the window panes shattered and a rock landed on the floor. We ran to the door. Ernie and 3 of his friends were pedaling their bikes up and down Little Hobart Street, whooping madly. "Garbage, garbage, y'all are a bunch of garbage." Brian went out on the porch. One of the kids hurled another rock that hit Brian in the head. He staggered back, then ran down the steps, but Ernie and his friends pedaled away, shrieking. Brian came back up the stairs, blood trickling down his cheek and onto his t-shirt in a pump knot already swelling above his eyebrow. Ernie's gang returned a few minutes later, throwing stones and shouting that they'd actually seen the pigsty where the Walls kids lived, and that they were going to tell the whole school. It was even worse than anyone said. This time, both Brian and I chased after them. Even though they outnumbered us, they were enjoying the game of taunting us too much to make a stand. They rode down to the first switchback and got away. "They'll be back," Brian said. "What are we going to do?" I asked. Brian sat thinking, then told me he had a plan. He found some rope under the house and led me up to a clearing in the hillside above Little Hobart Street. A few weeks later, Brian and I had dragged out an old mattress up there because we were thinking of camping out. Brian explained how we would make a catapult, just like the medieval ones we'd read about, by piling rocks on the mattress and rigging it with the ropes looped over tree branches. We quickly assembled the contraption and tested it once, jerking back on the ropes at the count of 3. It worked. A minor avalanche of rocks rained onto the street below. It was, we were convinced, enough to kill Ernie Goad and his gang, which was what we fully intended to do. Kill them and commandeer their bikes, leaving their bodies in the street as a warning to others. We piled the rocks back on the mattress, re-rigged the catapult, and waited. After a couple of minutes, Ernie and his gang reappeared at the switchback. Each of them rode one-handed and carried an egg-sized rock in his throwing hand. They were proceeding single file like a Pawnee war party, a few feet apart. We couldn't get them all at once, so we aimed for Ernie, who was at the head of the pack. When he came within range, Brian gave the word and we jerked back on the ropes. The mattress shot forward and our arsenal of rocks flew through the air. I heard them thud against Ernie's body and clatter on the road. He screamed and cursed as his bike skidded. The kid behind Ernie ran into him and they both fell. The other 2 turned around and sped off. Brian and I started hurling whatever rocks were at hand. Since they were downhill, we had a good line of fire and scored several direct hits, the rocks dinging off their bikes, nicking the paint and denting the fenders. Then Brian yelled, "Charge!" and we came barreling down the hill. Ernie and his friend jumped back on their bikes and furiously pedaled off before we could reach them. As they disappeared around the bend, Brian and I did a victory dance in the rock-strewn street, giving our own war whoops. As the weather warmed, a sort of rough beauty overtook the steep hillsides around Little Hobart Street. Jack-in-the-pulpits and bleeding hearts sprouted wild. White Queen Anne's lace and purple phlox and big orange daylilies blossomed along the road. During the winter, you could see abandoned cars and refrigerators in the shells of deserted houses in the woods, but in the spring, the vines and weeds and moss grew over them. In no time, they disappeared altogether. One benefit of summer was that each day we had more light to read by. Mom really piled up on books. She came home from the Welch Public Library every week or two with a pillowcase full of novels, biographies, and histories. She snuggled into bed with them, looking up from time to time, saying she was sorry. She knew she should be doing something more productive. But like Dad, she had her addictions, and one of them was reading. We all read, but I never had the feeling of togetherness I'd had in Battle Mountain, when we all sat around the depot with our books. In Welch, people drifted off to different corners of the house. Once night came, we kids all lay in our rope and cardboard beds, reading by flashlight or a candle we'd set on our wooden boxes, each of us creating our own little pool of dim light. Lori was the most obsessive reader. Fantasy and science fiction dazzled her, especially The Lord of the Rings. When she wasn't reading, she was drawing orcs or hobbits. She tried to get everyone in the family to read the books. They transport you to a different world, she'd say. I didn't want to be transported to another world. My favorite books all involved people dealing with hardships. I loved The Grapes of Wrath, Lord of the Flies, and especially A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I thought Francie Nolan and I were practically identical, except she had lived 50 years earlier in Brooklyn, and her mother always kept the house clean. Francie Nolan's father sure reminded me of Dad. If Francie saw the good in her father, even though most people considered him a shiftless drunk, maybe I wasn't a complete fool for believing in mine. Or trying to believe in him. It was getting harder. One night that summer, when I was lying in bed and everyone else was asleep, I heard the front door open and the sound of someone muttering and stumbling around in the darkness. Dad had come home. I went into the living room where he was sitting in the drafting table. I could see by the moonlight coming through the window that his face and hair were matted with blood. I asked him what happened. I got into a fight with a mountain, he said, and the mountain won. I looked at Mom asleep on the sofa bed, her head buried in a pillow. She was a deep sleeper and hadn't stirred. When I lit the kerosene lamp, I saw Dad also had a big gash in his right forearm and a cut on his head so deep I could see the white of his skull. I got a toothpick and tweezers and picked the rocky grit out of the gash. Dad didn't wince when I poured rubbing alcohol on the wound. Because of all of his hair, I had no way to put on a bandage, and I told Dad I should shave the area around the cut. Hell, honey, that would ruin my image, he said. A fellow in my position's got to look presentable. Dad studied the gash in his forearm. He tightened a tourniquet around his upper arm and told me to fetch Mom's sewing box. He fumbled around in it for a silk thread, but unable to find any, decided that cotton would be fine. He threaded a needle with black thread, handed it to me, and pointed at the gash. Sew it up, he said. Dad, I can't do that. Oh, go ahead, honey, he said. I'll do it myself, except I can't do diddly with my left hand. He smiled. Don't worry about me. I'm so thoroughly pickled I won't feel a thing. Dad lit a cigarette and placed his arm on the table. Go ahead, he said. I pressed the needle up against Dad's skin and shuddered. Go ahead, he said again. I pushed the needle and felt a slight tug when it pierced the skin. I wanted to close my eyes, but I needed to see. I pushed a little harder and felt the resistance of Dad's flesh. It was like sewing meat. It was sewing meat. I can't, Dad. I'm sorry. I just can't do it, I said. We'll do it together, Dad said. Using his left hand, he guided my fingers as they pushed the needle all the way in through his skin and out the other side. A few droplets of blood appeared. I pulled the needle out and then gave the thread a gentle jerk to tighten it. I tied the two ends of the thread together like Dad told me to, and then to put in a second stitch. Did it again. The gash was pretty big and could have used a few more stitches, but I couldn't bring myself to stick that needle in Dad's arm one more time. We both looked at the two dark, slightly sloppy stitches.